Welcome to 10-5, the official podcast of the OPP Association. My name is Scott Mills.
And I'm Emily Brown, and we're the Strategic Communications Coordinators for the OPP Association and your host for the 10-5 podcast, the official podcast of the OPP Association. The OPP Association is the sole bargaining agent for the close to 10,000 members of the Ontario Provincial Police in Canada. Our members are our focus and our strength, and we aim to provide important information to our members and the public about matters that affect policing in the province of Ontario.
Thank you, Emily. And today we welcome a retired OPP officer by the name of David Lalonde. He's talking to us from Sudbury, I believe, and he's going to be talking about his new, recently released novel that's called Death of a Millionaire. So welcome, David.
Well, thank you for the invitation, Scott and Emily, and OPPA. It's very good to be here.
To kick things off, David, can you tell us a little bit about your career with the OPP?
Well, I'll start at the end by saying that I retired after 30 years in 2015. But where my journey began was in 1985. My first posting was in Wawa, where I served as a uniformed constable. I met and married my wife there, Michelle, and we had our daughter, Dominique. After 4 years, we transferred down to Manotick, which is now part of the city of Ottawa. A big paradigm shift. Manotick Detachment was it's part of the city of Ottawa now, and much smaller area geographically, much busier area occurrence-wise. Manotick, I was there for almost 2 years, and then I got promoted to sergeant, and I was transferred up to Hearst, where I spent another 2 years. And at about the 8-year mark in my career, I call it a promotion. I suppose it's more of a transfer to a detective sergeant. And I was sent to the district headquarters, number 15 in South Porcupine. And I spent the remainder of my 22 years on the job as a detective sergeant doing criminal investigations. South Porcupine, from there to Kapuskasing, fabulous town. And then back to Sudbury in 2000, which is my hometown. And this is where I spent the bulk of my career.
That's quite the career story, David. And I note you noted you met your wife Michelle up in Wawa, and we were just talking just before we turned the recorder on here that Emily and Michelle used to work together up there. So
that's right, at Science North. Hello, Michelle.
And she's still there. It's a wonderful organization.
It is, for sure.
It's such a small world, and even though we're such a large geography here in Ontario, so many people are connected in so many different parts. So leads me to kind of our next question here for you, David. We understand that you currently work in a police foundations program, and I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that. We heard the kids in the background earlier outside your office when we were working on the prepping of the recordings. So you're right into it.
Back in 2010, while I was still on the job, an old colleague of mine, Gary Spooner, who had been the training sergeant in South Porcupine, wonderful man, wonderful, as so many of our training people are, just exemplified the OPP. He brought me to Cambrian to do a little bit of guest lecturing. That parlayed into a teaching here part-time beginning in 2010. With the support of the organization, I came to Cambrian and I started teaching a course each semester, which was, I'm sure you can imagine, particularly those of you who may be detective sergeants now, that's quite a juggling match, but I did do the juggle with support of the OPP and Cambrian College. Then in 2015, I hadn't really decided I was going to retire yet, though I was at the 30-year mark. I still loved the job and certainly the organization, but Cambrian offered me a job to come here full-time as the program coordinator and as a professor. And so I came in 2015. It was a marvelous switch in careers, and I've been here since that time.
That's great. Thanks, David. So let's get into this book of yours. I'm excited to hear about it. In preparation for this conversation, we've been seeing a number of news articles celebrating your book, and there's a buzz around it. And just want you to get into it and explain your book and why people might want to pick it up and give it a read.
Well, thank you for the attention. And you're right. I've been very fortunate, and I'm grateful for all the media attention that's come my way. The book is, it's a love letter to the OPP and to Northern Ontario. I had a fabulous career, met so many marvelous people, not just on the job, but in the communities that I worked. And to some extent, the book is an amalgam of bits and pieces of all the wonderful people I knew. And I suppose you could say I was motivated a little bit by, I love mysteries. I'm sure most people do. But most of these stories seem to be set in places like New York City or other large centers in the United States. I wanted to tell our story. And just as people, I'm sure I've never been to New York, but I bet you I could pick a New Yorker out of a crowd. I'd like people to know Northern Ontario, because we have our own unique character as well. So the book is set in 1985. It follows an investigation into a murder that occurs in a Northern Ontario community. The community is called Kerr Lake, which is obviously based to some extent on Kirkland Lake, though it is very much a fictional rendition of the community. It's my sort of Hogwarts version of Kirkland Lake, and throw in a number of other communities, if you will. So it's though it has a great deal of resemblance to Kirkland Lake, it's not. There's a lot of things that I've either made up or brought in from other communities. Now, it's sort of the seed of the idea for the investigation was based upon some issues Kirkland Lake had been having back in the 1980s with Toronto looking to dispose of their garbage there. And it was at a particularly bad time in Kirkland Lake's economy. And yet the people of Kirkland Lake, in spite of their need, held fast. And they said, no, we don't think this is good for the long-term future of the community. That's where things diverge into the fictional. So it's a murder that occurs in Kirkland Lake, and the town has to figure out whether this fellow who has been murdered, who arrived in the community a little earlier, was there to help the community, or whether he was there to just proverbially stick it to the community. And it follows an OPP investigation, 1985. The techniques and tactics are very much what they were then and what they continue to be. And in fact, I would argue what they were in John Wilson Murray's day. I'd written an article on Murray years ago for the OPP Review. I've done my master's degree in history, and I followed his career and those of other Victorian detectives. So it's very much the techniques and tactics are very much the same, and they center around people. At the end of the day, it is all about people. Part of why I used 1985 is, well, I was there. And another reason, of course, is these were the days before DNA became so fashionable. And DNA is valuable, but there were many other forensic techniques then that exist to this day that are, I would argue, just as valuable in terms of gathering circumstantial evidence. So it follows the investigation into this murder, and it introduces people that they're fictitious, but I hope my readers might recognize at least some aspects of themselves and other people who they've worked with in the book.
Now, I want to just interject here and ask David, is this your first foray into writing novels? And what gave you the inspiration to go down that road?
Well, it is my debut novel, though I can tell you it's going to be part of a series, and the sequel is just about done. The sequel seems to be flowing much faster than the original. It's going to be released early next year. What gave me the incentive? I have to be honest, Emily, I don't remember anymore, other than I'm a very passionate reader, and I suppose I always had it in my mind that as I was reading other police procedural mysteries that, I'd like to tell our story too. We've got our own stories to tell, and so that was my hope.
It's really a fascinating story, David. I really look forward to reading the book because even though it's fiction, you've lived the life, so you know how it all works, and just reading that, I think it'd be a really interesting read, especially for a guy like myself, 30 years in policing, and the Northern Ontario aspect of it is quite intriguing as well. So, where can people pick that book up, David? Christmas is coming up, and maybe make a good gift.
It would make a fabulous gift, and it's the sort of thing you'll want to read over and over again. So everyone should have one. It's available on Amazon.ca, and sales have been rather good. Actually, I'm quite pleased, quite flattered, humbled by that. Actually, so it's available on Amazon.ca, and I'm just reminded of one of my favorite authors was a fellow named James Jones. He wrote From Here to Eternity. He was an American author who wrote of his experiences in the Second World War. And what Jones said in one of his books is that he's putting himself as the character back in 1942, and he's saying one day one amongst them would write a novel of their experiences, and they would all say, "That's not the way it was," because that's not the way they would remember it. But my hope is that those who do read the book will see things that they do remember, and remember that it's not a story just about my memories and experiences. It's a story about our experiences.
And for those of you listening, we'll include all of the links and whatnot in the show notes below.
Thanks for mentioning that, Emily, including I've got a website which has a blog that I've started, and I mentioned to you my passion is historical detectives. It started out with reading John Wilson Murray's book, which I've read again and again and again, and I'm a great collector of his first editions. But those of you who are interested in Victorian detectives, reporters, investigative reporters, and criminals, I think would find it my blog fascinating. I think I might be able to draw your attention to some just marvelous characters in history who wrote their memoirs, and so I hope people might check that out to dcijackbutler.com.
Jack Butler. I love it.
Well, I tell you, the name is based upon my father's name was Jack and my mother's maiden name was Butler. So I drew it from my family.
It's intriguing. It's all makes you want to go and read that book. So I got a question for you here, David. So in many of these articles, you've stated here on the podcast here and in the articles that we were reading, some of what is written is fact. And I was wondering, without giving away any secrets of anything on here, can you share us any of those situations that stuck with you as an officer that actually come to life in the book?
Well, absolutely. But I'll just preface that by saying back when I was still on the job, I had a member of our human resources branch approach me one time and say, is there anything that precludes retired members from sharing details on previous investigations? And we looked into it, and I don't claim to be a scholar on this, but my conclusion and my advice was I think it would be dishonorable to share details such as that. I think while our oath may not continue after retirement, I think our duty to the public and to ongoing and past investigations and the people involved does. With that said, some things which are included in the book are based unquestionably upon my own experiences. Now, as you can imagine, a detective sergeant, we receive all the notifications of deaths that occur, sudden deaths in our area. So after 22 years and many, many homicide investigations that I was involved in as a team member, it's not a one-man or one-woman army. So after all these death investigations, I went to hundreds of postmortems, many, many more sudden deaths themselves. So I spent a great deal of time in the autopsy suite. And so there's a description of an autopsy in the book that's, again, based upon my extensive experience as an observer in the autopsy suite. Another thing that's described quite vividly is what it's like to come on to a crime scene and what you see and just how even after 30 years on the job, I was at a murder just shortly, I think it was 2 days before I did my interview to get hired full time by Cambrian. And I can remember arriving at that scene, and I'd been to so many before, and you always feel like a rookie, like a fish out of water. And so you have to fall back on the things you know, and one of the guiding principles that the OPP has in criminal investigations, and that is follow the evidence. And so it describes the that sort of anxiety that occurs when you attend a scene, the kind of observations that police officers make with respect to time of death, etc., on the body. And I'll tell you one of the other things that I describe in the book that isn't often talked about, except perhaps by people who are in the traveling trades of the OPP, the criminal investigators, the emergency response folks, some of the traffic units. Lots of us spend a lot of time away from home, and that's loneliness. It's lonely being away from your family, and it's a great sacrifice we make to be away from our families in pursuit of our duty. So I try and touch upon that as well. I'm just trying to humanize the characters.
I appreciate you sharing that, David. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We have a tradition on the 10-5 podcast, time permitting, that we like to ask our guests about what their 3 wishes would be. And it sparks some really good conversations and some good outcomes from it. So, what are your 3 wishes? And that could be in policing, the world at large, something personal. Can you share that with us, please?
Yeah, and I'm glad I knew you were going to ask me this question ahead of time, so I could have a little bit of chance to prepare, because I probably would have passed on it. But I'm going to relate the 3 of them to policing, and part of this is motivated by the wonderful assistance I've been receiving lately from our veterans. I put out a message asking about what police training was like in the late 1950s, because the police college didn't exist back then. And I'll tell you, it was motivated by my own father, who was a policeman in Sudbury. And my father had been released from the armed forces, had shown up at Sudbury police headquarters and wanted to apply for a job. And they said, well, what's your education? And my dad, he's since passed away, one of the most marvelously well-educated men I know, said, I've got grade 9. And they said, well, we don't take people with grade 9. You need a grade 10 to be a police officer. And so my dad thanked him. And as he was turning to leave, the fellow said, well, where are you from anyway? My dad said, I just got out of the Army. And so the sergeant at the desk, he said, come on back at 6 o'clock. And my dad showed back up at 6 that evening. They gave him a uniform, a Sam Brown. They stuffed his holster with newspaper. And my dad said, what do I do? And the sergeant said, go find people. If you think they're doing something wrong, bring them in and we'll figure it out. So things changed. But I'll tell you, some of the response I've been receiving from our veterans indicates wasn't all that much different for the OPP. So my first wish is gratitude. And that's gratitude for those who have served and continue to serve our nation, and that we stand on their shoulders. And one thing I tell my students is, you're going to be driving by some kids one day in a car with your police car, and if the kids are anything like me, they're going to be out there waving and trying to get their attention, and they're not really going to be waving at you. They're going to be waving at all the police officers who came before you. So gratitude is my first wish, and that extends to being grateful for your own sacrifices. My second wish is that those who are still on the job, is that you enjoy your time on the proverbial ice. Every police officer starts off at about the 6-month mark, starting to talk about retirement. That's normal. But I can assure you, there is life after policing, and you will, I hope, reflect back on your career with enormous pride and great memories. So enjoy your time on the ice. Don't wish your life away, because you're going to be just fine in retirement. There's life after policing, and it's good. And finally, my third wish, I'm going to quote that famous medical professional, Dr. Seuss, when I say that I hope we'll all remember that those who mind don't matter, and those who matter don't mind.
Bravo, I love it.
That's awesome, David. We're finishing up here, and it's been a pleasure to speak with you for sure. And I'm sure many of our listeners will find what you've had to say here quite interesting. Do you have any last words before we go?
Yes, I will tell you that as I appreciated the OPP and the OPPA very much when I was on the job, but for some reason I don't know why, it just meant so much more to me when I retired, and I still get these messages, and it feels good. So thanks.
Well, we appreciate you saying that. We're sending those messages out, so sometimes we wonder if anybody's listening. So,
well, they are, and I've quoted your. He's aware of this. I've used our president John Cherasolo's last name in my book. John used to work for me back when we were on the job, and he was an excellent detective and a great man, and he had a great last name, so I used his last name for one of my characters, and it's nothing like John. John was so much more better looking and intelligent, but tried to immortalize John Cherasolo. So take that, Cherasolo.
Does John know this, or is this going to be a surprise to him?
He knows it, and I think that if you know John well enough, you would know that he probably assumes that any favorable character is based on him anyway. So that's said with great affection, I assure you.
Oh, well, we thank you, David, for taking time to interview with us today, and we look forward to reading this book.
Well, thank you very much. And folks who are still on the job and retired who are out there, what you're doing makes a difference. You are appreciated. So keep it up.
You have been listening to retired OPP officer David Lalonde here on the 10-5 podcast, speaking about his new book, Death of a Millionaire. And as we mentioned before, check out the show notes for information of how to get your hands on that. That is our episode for this week. A new episode of the 10-5 podcast drops every other Friday morning on all of the major podcasting platforms. Please consider subscribing where you get your podcasts so you never miss an episode. Scott and I are honored to host this podcast. If you have any questions or ideas for future episodes, please feel free to email us at communications@oppa.ca. Until next time, thanks for listening and stay safe.